the Casper Canadian equivalent called Ebby. They work with an anti-malaria association, and for every bed that you buy, ND gives this net in a developing country. So there's sort of that element of community approval because you're participating in that, and it's sort of a hashtagable moment. So it's not so much that it's a purchase, it's an event, and you're participating in a community, which is an irony because the reason that you didn't want to be part of a community that you sort of distrusted or were cynical of, which is the interaction, the experience in the showroom of the mattress, you're now sort of joining a different community that you're not participating in. Do you know what I mean?
Welcome to Uprising. Each episode looks inside what it takes to lead the most dynamic and successful cultural movements. Some of them in the business world, some in the social realm, some in politics, and some in between, to see why people start uprisings. What gives those initiatives momentum and keeps them going? And most important, what lessons can you learn from these movements and how to apply them to your business and even personal life? Let's explore the secret to sparking movements that move people into action.
Passionate ideas.
Controversial ideas.
Uprising ideas.
The power is now in the hands of anyone.
To start a cultural movement.
Your movement.
To
move the world.
Today's Uprising pod is brought to you by warbyparker.com. Get a free 5-day home try-on at www.warbyparkertrial.com/uprising. 5 pairs, 5 days, 100% free.
Welcome to Uprising. We are talking today with Nathalie Atkinson, a respected journalist from the Globe and Mail, and is followed by people in business and in marketing. She writes about brands, she writes about societal shifts that are happening, and she recently wrote a fascinating article called Disrupting Disruptors, which talks about new brands having the opportunity to come into a marketplace where consumers are embracing them. And these brands are representing movements that are changing the landscape. And for the first time, really giving consumers products, new types of technologies that they're embracing. For years, if you think about it, for many, many years, people had a choice of brands that, you could buy at department stores when it came to beds, or if it came to stamps, you had to go down to the post office. And now, these new brands are coming in, and people are really not only open to trying them, they're seriously embracing them in all fields, in fintech, in home electronics, in furniture, in services. And if you listen to podcasts, which feature some ads of brands you may not have heard of, you'll hear brands like Casper, which makes beds. You'll hear about stamps.com. And those are some of the names that represent this new wave that I'm talking about. So we have Nathalie on the phone. Welcome to Uprising.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So how did you come to this realization that there was something bubbling up?
Well, I mean, generally, the way I start the piece is really the genesis of this, which is that January tends to be the time when these large appliance purchases, new beds, the clearance, because there's this old monolithic model or monopolistic retail model where, the new bed models come in and they have to have big sales and get rid of them. So I always used to tell people, because I've been writing about retail and marketing and different parts of the culture for about 15 years. So I would tell people who wrote in, well, wait till January or July, the big white sales. And I think this year is the first year that is really not the case because of Casper and the many brands in its category that it has sort of spawned.
Do you think that we have a generation of people that are just fed up with going down to the store, and that these brands are really just taking advantage of that sort of angst?
I think there's an element of that. I think there's an element of distrust, or there's sort of the brands create this new product that is not necessarily new, but is new because it's adaptable to a disruptive distribution model. So, they sort of upset this traditional paradigm. Say, if we look at mattresses, which is a great example because they're unwieldy, right? And they have to come with a box spring, and that really limits the storage. And it also means that you have to have overhead and warehousing and all of these things. You look at the mattress industry and you have to basically go down to a store or showroom and put your faith in somebody who may be selling you, right? How do you know what they're telling you is authentic? There's all these, it's sort of laid bare the different incentives, the same way as we think about big car or big makeup, big cosmetics, the sort of monthly goals and incentives. And so these things have been stripped away, and now you don't have to go to the showroom anymore because the actual product is more deliverable and easily accessible.
So like this classic salesperson who's sort of hovering over you, we've developed an automatic repulsion to that, and we just don't want that anymore. That selling is just something we just don't even want to bother with. So we want this sort of user-friendly experience where we decide what we want when we want it. We have the information and we buy. Yes,
there's a sort of distrust of experts. I mean, that's not necessarily new. I would say that the last 5 or 7 years with peer reviews, right? Sephora hosts its own peer reviews on its site of products. Goodreads does the same thing. Yelp reviews, TripAdvisor. The sort of peer authenticity or supposed authenticity is sort of privileged there. I mean, Casper has a competitor called Tuft & Needle that's slightly upscale, and their video on their homepage the video itself is called "Mattress Stores Are Greedy," and that is the slogan of its billboards. It kind of creates a manifesto, and it's like an us and them sort of situation.
So last year, there's a razor brand called Harry's that sold to Unilever for hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yes.
And it really is famous for the CEO of the company and founder doing a YouTube video basically saying that his razor blades are fucking good or something like that. And that just everyone went, yeah, that's the truth. What other sort of elements or sort of values do you think brands need to be part of this new cult, like this honesty, and what other things have you sort of come across to be successful?
Well, maybe a year or two ago, I wrote it was a criticism, it was a critique column of, the buy one, give one, the Tom's shoes model being the most maybe famous or most people are familiar with, which I don't agree with it, but I think it's effective. And I make that distinction, is that turning the shopper into a philanthropist or implying that by shopping, you're performing an act of philanthropy. That you're not a customer, you're a benefactor. Here's another example that, because I was trying to sort of stick to home goods generally, but I think it's a great example. It's a company that is on the rise. It's called The Ordinary, and they're positioning themselves like private label or generic pharmaceuticals, but as a skincare brand. So in direct opposition to the wholesale and, premium brands like all the Estee Lauder portfolios. So the words that they use in their, they call pricing integrity, which, again, very interesting choice of words. They call their prices honorable prices. And so it's sort of the idea of honorable capitalism. And so the formulations and the ingredients are all on the package, just like if you were buying, generic pharmaceuticals. And they have a new collection that's coming out that is cosmetics, and they're calling this, it's makeup, but the tagline is color formulations with mindfulness. I mean, it's makeup, but they're calling it mindful. I mean, these associations and buzzwords and sort of picking them out of the ether and pairing them together are really effective, I think, because they're sort of positioning themselves as an authority or sort of as a renegade, in the way I think I've read you talk about, IKEA and different companies. I think that this motion, this Casper thing, goes back more to Volkswagen.
We found a wonderful bargain, a little beetle Volkswagen.
In 59 and 60, when Volkswagen was just, being like a countercultural product, the less is more, sort of in opposition to, it rejects all the values of the previous generation, right, of its parents, of the materialistic culture of the 50s and the Eisenhower era. And I kind of feel like Casper and this new wave is doing that with, the greed is good era and the sort of the wealth era that we've just come out of, post-recession.
And do you think that consumers are being hoodwinked, or are they genuinely happy to be part of this when they're, as you describe in your article, posting unboxing videos and photos on their social media feeds?
I mean, I think the proof will be in the product. Casper is a very young brand, so and it's many competitors now because the field is getting pretty cluttered. So what ends up happening is you are comparison shopping, but you're doing it at home through peer reviews and through looking, online and through brands that don't communicate with another under an umbrella of a showroom. So it's kind of this. It all ends up in the same place anyway. But what I think is interesting about, a Warby Parker, which is the eyewear, or a Casper, is that it's fairly young and we don't really know how the product's going to fare. I mean, Dyson, which just did the same sort of disruption based on product innovation over a decade ago, is, completely changed the industry, the vacuum cleaner industry, and up the pricing that people are prepared to pay and all of those things. But I don't know if the comfort is going to be there for Casper. I mean, the thing that people don't talk about with Casper is that it's good for, and I think I mentioned this, I said it's sort of good for many people, but not for most, because if you do look at the reviews, like the serious engineering reviews of these sorts of memory foam and similar mattresses, they're not really good for people who are particularly heavy, 250 pounds and up. And so then Casper has come up with their, box spring in a box, which sort of helps make them better for a slightly larger person category. But, if you look at the average weight and size of an American or a Canadian, that's many, and that's enough to make a business, but it's maybe not most or all. So I'm curious to see how people what the medical sort of research might be alongside all these people now on coil-free and less supportive mattresses. But I do think that, that the way they market things obscures the actual function of something you sleep in for 7 or 8 hours in theory a day. Right.
You're a social observer, journalist, anthropologist. What are the differences between consumers today and consumers, let's say, 5 years ago?
I would like to say that they're savvier. I mean, sort of the general consumer is savvier and is more aware of the sort of man or woman behind the curtain, to use a Wizard of Oz sort of reference. It's like a time of real flux right now. I think, because we've got the idea of the influencer and, speaking of hashtagable, the way in which so many of the traditional advertising dollars and models are moving to influencer and sort of less visible, because, the FTC disclosures are never or hardly ever adhered to in Canada. There isn't even that. But the disclosure of, being a sort of spokesperson in a sort of soft way on Instagram. And my question is whether the sort of consumers of this new way of receiving marketing and advertising know that they're being marketed and advertised to. And if they know, maybe they don't even care. Maybe it doesn't really matter, this Chinese wall between the editorial and the advertising, or sort of this people having vested interests in promoting a product. Ashton Kutcher's part owner or something of Twitter. Right. So, of course he's on Twitter, and, maybe we'll find out that Trump was actually a part owner of Twitter or something in the future. Yeah. Tax disclosures, I don't know. So I think there's a higher level of savviness. And I don't just mean, the millennial generation. I mean, across everything. But I just wonder if that actually is going to change the way we purchase or not. I'm not so sure.
Well, they say the new addiction is Amazon Prime. It's like we're addicted to the ease with which we can just order up the latest lamp.
Yes, we don't want any sort of impediment to instant gratification.
Right.
And, and that goes hand in hand with the whole planned obsolescence, right? Although Amazon's interesting because their Prime, one of the things I looked at was the Prime menswear, which is where they're really growing in terms of their fashion offering. They've got a number of different of private label brands. And they're growing more quickly there, I would argue, than with the women's, which is more subject to sort of the vagaries of fad and trend. And so there's a way in which this maybe subscription model or instant model is going to change the aesthetics too. Like when you think of Uniqlo being sort of generic and you can buy the same sweater at Uniqlo 3 years in a row, the same way you could buy the same Volkswagen, it was virtually unchanged. Or if they did make improvements to it, it was retrofittable throughout the 60s, right?
For you, the listeners of Scott Goodson's Uprising pod, Warby Parker is offering a free 5-day home try-on to give you the opportunity to check out their glasses. To get your home try-on today, go to warbyparkertrial.com/uprising. Again, that's warbyparkertrial.com/uprising for your free 5-day home try-on.
We're talking today about disrupting the disruptors. Inherent in that headline is the idea that even brands that I guess originally were challenger brands and now have become big and have an audience who are fans, that there's a new generation of brands coming in and disrupting those that were there prior. So are we really just talking about like just a generational shift? Every new generation, no generation wants to buy the same crap as their brother or their father. Is that maybe a human insight?
I think that there's a lot of credence to that. I mean, notwithstanding the life cycle of the product itself, or the excellence of the products, it's sort of this counterculture of consumerism that it seems to happen. I mean, you look at the late 80s in the UK, there was this sort of craft movement that was in response to the 70s sort of mechanization and factorization of clothing, because that's really, the 70s is really when ready to wear and fast fashion began, largely in the UK, before it hit, Sweden with H&M or Zara in Spain. It was in England. So in England, you have in London, in East London, a real opposition and digging in the heels and a whole movement like Vivienne Westwood and stuff. So you know these sort of cycles of technological advance and then return to these values, right? Buying into values and belonging in this case to a community. I mean, it's so fascinating that Casper is doing this thing which allows you to buy a bed without having to speak to a person or go anywhere, and you can do it at 3 a.m. And yet, there's that same consumer, in theory, is the one who wants to go and meet the market farmer and buy the heirloom tomato and hear the narrative of the heirloom tomato. Because, that enhances not just the experience, but sort of the sense of, well-being, this connection-disconnection thing. A few years ago, I talked to the author of a book called Packaged Pleasures, who sort of looked at the segmentation of experience, the way in which Sunday night television now, Twitter has a whole division that develops hashtags and partners with television shows because no one's watching, or Thursday night television when Seinfeld used to be on, no one's having that community experience, even segmenting it in their own homes, because it's sort of the vending machine of television. And so to create an event where there isn't one, because people can watch things when they want, they are creating this moment in time with a hashtag, so that they're creating a community across technology. I mean, there's this kind of juxtaposition of these things that are happening at the same time. We sort of want the convenience, but we want the experience. And the sort of end of my column kind of explains that Casper and all of these places still had to open showrooms. So now it's in fact, unfortunately, less convenient for that consumer who wants the fast bed to buy, because there's now 7 different brands like Casper to choose from, all of whom have slightly different lingo and different technologies. And so you basically want to test them all out, and you have to go to 7 different places instead of the one super showroom like a Sleepy. Yeah,
exactly. And eventually they have to have multi-platforming. That's the only way to succeed anyway. Consumers have to be able, some of them anyway, want to be able to be proud of their brand and see them on the high street or on some of the street.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, Everlane's done that. I mean, different. You talk about is it Harry or Dollar Shave Club you were talking about? But Frank and Oak, which is a Montreal-based company, menswear company that has really grown and is expanding into the U.S. Has opened showrooms. There's a company that they don't call their stores. They're called guide shops. Bonobos Menswear. Do you know that e-tailer? I think they're out of the U.S., but they don't you can't buy anything in their store, but you go in there to sort of get your size and figure out, which of the designs you like, and then you buy them online, and they call them guide shops. There is a prestige to being, on Madison or whatever, next to the J. Crew Superstore and the Gucci and everything else. And that's a whole part of, consumer psychology that is going to be an interesting thing for those brands that are disruptors, that are digital native, to reconcile.
I grew up in Canada. My father was in the Canadian Air Force during the war, came back, eventually married my mother. I was born in an era when, there was women were super, wearing kind of Fleetwood Mac-esque kind of flowing dresses, and guys were kind of cool with long hair, and music was really important, and they invented the pill. And so our generation was really, a very different generation than obviously my dad's generation. And, the generation today is growing up in a world that's shaped by technology, shaped by a borderless world to a large extent for many people. And that borderless doesn't necessarily just mean like geographical borderless. It's like the ability to have access to things that, just weren't not accessible before. That shapes people's, I guess, feelings of boredom, right? So they feel like, okay, there are certain things out there that are kind of boring. They're of the last generation, and brands that are able to, as you've said, have, project certain values, maybe stand for something that is going to make the world a better place, tackle some bigger issue, whether it's malaria, as you describe in your article, or it's giving people, access to water, or supporting, giving a free pair of glasses when you buy one pair of glasses, whatever that is. If that fits into your worldview based on 2017's generation's worldview, then that, I guess, is a recipe for success.
Well, it depends on what the prevailing worldview is. I mean, the cautionary tale there, when I think of, because we're talking about, again, this idea of the honorable capitalism model in some way, and define honorable. I mean, some people would define the Hobby Lobby's insistence. I mean, Hobby Lobby being treated, having the right, being a corporation, but having the rights of an individual, basically, is what the United States conferred on them, and they have the right to say that they don't want to support the extended health care of their employees. And so, to some people that's honorable in one sense, and then to another, it's not. So, there's the Hobby Lobby boycott because they won't support, contraception, family planning, all that stuff. So I guess it just depends on where the needle is for that. At the moment, the needle is for transparency. I mean, we're still in the wake of the Rana Plaza and the supply chain problems that we talk about with not just furniture and sort of things made in developing countries, but clothing and, contaminated cosmetics or baby food and
right.
The industrialization of everything. And so, yes, the values are of, more care and accountability for companies, I guess.
So I have one last question, and that
Sure.
is around, do you think that brands that are, let's say, creating movements by doing what we just talked about, do you think that there's a controversy in there because they're really co-opting social movements? They're basically companies trying to, create shareholder value or sell stuff.
I do, actually. I mean, like I said, the Tom's piece that I wrote a couple of years ago was, I think there's a real problem in development circles. Development workers have this acronym called SWEDOW, which is stuff we don't want, to describe all this well-meaning but really often ineffective aid and donations that, and the voluntourism and things that are, they sort of try to fix the symptoms but not the problem. And, you can't fundamentally shop your way to a better world. You can't. Maybe you can boycott your way to a better world, as we've seen with Macy's and Nordstrom's pulling Ivanka Trump's product in a response to consumer pressure. But that wasn't I don't think that was a moral response from those retailers. That was a business response. It was a financial one, right?
That's
so
true. Yeah.
Fundamentally, they're going to act in their own interest.
Well, everybody seems to be boycotting Breitbart News and a number of other brands. So, and those backlashes, I guess, are also a form of a movement. So they, community engagement, backlash, riot, that seems to be the social norm right now in this country anyway.
I know. I mean, I've been watching this Budweiser advertising from the Super Bowl unfold with, the backlash to the backlash to the backlash. I can't really keep up. I mean, and then there's also the danger of, the hashtag, this sort of this hashtagable moment when you're unboxing your bed and you're part of this group, but then the hashtag, the danger of thinking that a hashtag has solved a problem.
I think what Budweiser has done, and I actually personally love it, is they take a stand about something that's relevant to a lot of people, and they're kind of curating a debate. And in today's world, I think there's a risk that you just stick your head in the sand and try to anxiously avoid being pointed out, or a hashtag for being, having people against you. But unless you stand for something, you're kind of invisible, and you run the risk of disappearing completely. Happened with Hillary,
stand
right?
For something, Volkswagen stood for not your parent's car, basically, right?
Yeah.
And it was the
Right,
technology
the big
was there, it was
car
easily
and all that.
fixed, and it was cheaper and everything.
Yeah.
But it sort of stood for what it didn't stand for. Right, it was the rejection is what it stood for.
Right.
So I'm curious to see right now is a crazy time of flux. If there's one place that's more interested and more worried about what's happening in the United States landscape right now, it's Canada. So we're all glued to it.
I just saw an article in your newspaper yesterday. I think it was in your newspaper. It said that a recent poll said that majority of Canadians are asking your Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, to stand up to Trump. Regardless if it starts a trade war.
Yes, that is true. That has been the last 2-3 days. That's been the big thing, because apparently one of our I think it's our newly appointed, I want to say trade minister, just went sort of not surreptitiously, but just sort of was seen in Washington in the last couple of days, and that has caused an uproar. And of course, with Brexit happening, we're as invested in sort of being a Commonwealth country in some ways, and that heritage from England as we are with neighboring the US. So what's happening in the UK and Theresa May, and sort of even whether the Queen who, if you've watched The Crown on Netflix, you realize that, she's sort of the yay or nay, but she really has no other kind of constitutional power, that whether the Queen should receive Trump or not, and what that says, and again, she's usually neutral. She is the Switzerland of England, and she, we're trying to pressure her not to receive Trump because of the normalizing and the sort of visuals on that.
You're on a roll, so I might as well play once in a while we play a game. We call it prediction. It's kind of like da-da-da. What's happening, in the next year? What are we going to see in terms of brands and values and culture? You see these movements happening on the street, protests. How is that going to affect the way people think about brands?
If I just look at it from the sort of women's wear daily reports that I read every day, and the last 6 months of reading retail reports, because brand, things that people buy, I think there's a market. I've been saying this for a few years, and in a hopeful way, because I do hope that there's a market correction. I mean, the free market corrects itself, and all of these things create a lot of unrest and anxiety. And I know that the holiday season was really not good for independent retail or, the large retailers. Look at what's happening with Tiffany & Company. Tiffany & Company is just, booted out their CEO. They just switched up the fairly new creative director because they're just not, they've said, we've done all these things and we're still not happy with the results. And that's because people aren't buying the way they used to. And I think that that's good, because I think what I've been hoping for and predicting is that people will buy less but better and more thoughtfully, hopefully. And if people with, who have that choice, who have the disposable income and who can make choices, but not just based on basic need. And I think that's what's going to happen.
I think there's a book in there, in that idea. That's a great way to punctuate this discussion. Nathalie Atkinson, thank you so much for joining us today. Nathalie is a journalist. She is a writer. She is a social commentator. She has a lot of opinions that are relevant to what I do and what we do in marketing. And thank you for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining our Uprising today and listening to our show. If you missed the show, or if you want to find out more about who was on, or if you want to learn more about how to create your own Uprising, please go to uprisingmovements.com. You can also download this Uprising program from iTunes. Uprising was produced by Nicola Keneally and Adam Helen, with special help from Melanie Boardman, Karin Drachenberg, Philippa Freeman, Brianna Campbell, Fashad Faroudi, Mark Bruzy, Will Issam, James Politi, and Jonathan Weeks. My name is Scott Goodson, and you've been listening to Uprising. What we can learn about movements and uprisings that are shaping our world in business, in society, and in between. For more on cultural movements and movement marketing, be sure to pick up a copy of the best-selling book Uprising, How to Build a Brand and Change the World by Sparking Cultural Movements, available on Amazon.com. Music for Uprising composed by Charles Duchateau.